All right. Welcome, everyone. We are doing our astrometrics lab. Hello. Welcome to the party. Again, like always, let me know if you have any problems finding me. I need to edit this stream real quick. So just give me 1 second. Talk about what we're actually talking about today, which is going to be The Visitor and Trials and Tribble-ations. Whoop whoop. All right. Good times. I am super excited. I watched these today. It's an upsetting episode at first, and then it is an adorable episode after that. I always tell myself I'm not going to cry. I cried, unsurprisingly. I had to go pause it and go find tissues, and then I got to watch Trials and Tribble-ations, so in the end it wasn't too bad, but it was a little bit tough to get through. So if any of you watched these recently, fantastic. If any of you watched these for the first time, I'm sorry. I did try to emphasize to watch The Visitor first. Yes, one always cries. 'Cause it's tragic. Hey. The Visitor is a great episode. It's just really painfully well acted. And that's okay. I mean, even if you haven't seen him recently, if you saw him a little while ago, to be honest, I've rewatched Deep Space Nine like 3 times in the last couple of years, and I've skipped The Visitor just because I know how much I'm going to cry. And even then I cried again. And I didn't think I would because I knew it was coming. So yeah, it's he's so good. He's so good. And Ben Sisko is so good as well. It's just, it breaks your heart. He's so good when he comes back. Anyway, let's kick it off and actually talk about the episode instead of just diving into the open weeping. But there was actually some decent science in this. I've always kind of had it in my mind as just a really sad, upsetting, thanks for the host, time travel episode. And I didn't quite realize how much science they throw out in here. And it's pretty good. I like the way they talk about it, at least. So for those of you who haven't watched it in a long time, this idea, it opens, it's actually it's season 4, episode 2, which is right after Worf joins. So they have that big Klingon thing, that the 2-parter at the end of season 3 and into season 4. And then the second episode of season 4 is this one, The Visitor. And it opens with old Jake Sisko welcoming this woman in. I mean, no joke, he's so good. And he opens this woman in who, let's be honest, she's a little stalkery. She's adorable, but she's a little stalkery. I've been tempted to pull that kind of behavior before and haven't, and because stalker reasons. Yeah, Melanie, she's little stalkery, but it's fine. He needs some companionship, quite obviously, which is lovely and adorable and very nice. And, they reveal that Jake was a writer, which is great. He stopped writing before he turned 40. And then it's sort of goes into this story that Ben died when Jake was 18. And so that kind of throws the viewer of going, oh God, what's happening? What's going on? And in terms of storytelling technique, this episode is very good. It sucks you in right away from the beginning, even with the slightly stalker Melanie writer friend. But what's going on is Jake is kind of being teenage Jake, as we know and love. And Ben is trying to get him to be more engaged. So he wants him to go to watch the wormhole, our wormhole that Deep Space Nine is based on, subspace inversion, which is a thing that they say happens once every 50 years. So what's that? We're here to talk about the science, not just cry over a sad episode. But this subspace inversion, a wormhole subspace inversion, is kind of technobabbly, but we can kind of unpack it. So if we think about what a wormhole is, and we talked about this last week, wormhole is connecting 2 points in space and time. In this show, in this series, that's entirely based around a wormhole, it is connecting the alpha quadrant and the gamma quadrant, and it opens and shuts, but it's basically a fixed point-to-point travel, as opposed to like the one we talked about last week, which was decaying and was collapsing. This is a relatively stable wormhole that connects 2 points in space together. And this subspace inversion, what's subspace? Star Trek uses it all the time, but it's connecting 2 points in space and time. You think about the wormhole. So let's imagine the alpha quadrant's here, the gamma quadrant is on some plane of the universe, and let's just imagine it's here, and the wormhole is shortcutting the distance that you would normally have to travel to get there. And that sort of tunnel, that wormhole, that space in between these two of them, that would be subspace. And so the wormhole kind of connects them like a tunnel. And I've spent a lot of time trying to think about the wormhole in Deep Space Nine, and this idea that, all right, if we think about it like this, and maybe the universe, local to the Milky Way is doing that, and this is a shortcut, the fact that they in the wormhole here are living perpendicular to our space-time, that's like the prophets, that's how they can be in all points in our time, and I've spent too long thinking about it, and it's not relevant to this at all. But you have this wormhole that's connecting the 2 points in space and time, and if it's having a subspace inversion, that means, okay, inversion means, turning something inside out, and subspace would be that space in between our normal space. So subspace inversion. So let's imagine that instead of a wormhole that's going down, it's going to, something in its space-time setup is going to invert it. So suddenly it spits out a lot of energy. Some people have referred to the opposite of a black hole as a white hole that's like spitting out, or the other side of a wormhole might behave like that. And you can think of that being like a subspace inversion. Fine to think about. There's no rhyme or reason to it. I don't think there's a lot of sort of physics behind necessarily how that would happen. I mean, we barely understand the geometry of black holes, and we know geometrically black holes and wormholes look the same to the outside viewer. We just don't know what happens the deeper and deeper and deeper you get into a black hole, and if one would end up connecting another point to be in the gamma quadrant, for example. And so if there's an inversion, you imagine, like, we do have these sort of regular pulses in astronomy that we see. There's, especially with, we get flares from binary white dwarfs and like normal stars. You get these flares that happen because if you have a binary star system and one star has died before the other one just because of the masses of the two of them, one star would be, it almost starts absorbing the outer layers of this parent star, and then it occasionally flashes. And we've observed this with X-ray telescopes before, the Chandra telescope. And so, and it's on a regular basis because you're just in this constant loop of absorbing this energy and then, flinging it, and then building it all up again and then flinging it. So these sort of cyclical things do happen in space, but a subspace inversion that happens every 50 years is pretty much made up. And I'm glad you're enjoying it. There's not a pop quiz at the end, I promise. I do have notes, but they're for me, not for you. Don't worry. But I'm glad you're enjoying it. So once every 50 years, there's the subspace inversion in this wormhole. We can imagine it's maybe like it's absorbing energy, whatever is going on with this wormhole. It reaches some capacity that it goes, and then it settles back down and it's normal again. And then approximately 50 years later, it goes, and then it goes back to normal again. We can imagine it doing it that way. And so they go see it. They go to check it out. Jake gets dragged along like a pouty teenager, which is fine because he's a pouty teenager, and gets dragged along. They notice, I think it's O'Brien or Dax, says that the gravimetric field is surging. The gravimetric field, I interpret as the space-time field fabric. Like the fabric of space-time would be the gravimetric field, because gravity really is just the warping of space-time due to the presence of mass. So a gravimetric field would be the gravity, space-time gravity, that is starting to surge. As we talked about, it's starting to do that which is propagating out. So you get this gravimetric field that's surging, and it screws up the warp core. Basically, the warp core power goes off the scale. They run down to try to fix it. They mentioned that the warp coils are on a feedback loop. And this is where I was like, oh man, I'm like having to pause it and make all these notes because, like I said, I didn't remember how much sort of good technobabble they throw out in this episode, but it is really good. So they mentioned that the warp coils are now locked in a feedback loop because something happened. When that gravimetric field, a warp core's entire intention is to warp space-time. So it, as this sort of gravimetric surge field, whatever, pulse passed by the warp core, it got locked into a feedback loop. Now, a lot of us are familiar with what a feedback loop is, and intuitively it makes sense. But for those of you who might not necessarily remember what it is, there's lots of different analogies that we can use for it. A good one that you usually learn in a classroom or something is, this idea of carbon dioxide-based global warming. This idea that as the Earth gets warmer, it melts more ice caps, which means we don't reflect as much, which means we get warmer, which melts more ice caps, which means we get warmer, so it's like that's a constant feedback loop. It's just increasing and increasing, and it's constantly making the situation worse and worse and worse with every iteration. And another example is sort of resonant frequencies. So when you're breaking step on a bridge, because if you're hiking and you're hiking along a bridge and you start to feel the bridge like do that, and it gets worse and worse and worse every single time you take a step, that's because you've hit its resonant frequency. And a tragic example of this was the Tacoma Bridge incident in Washington State, where there was a weather pattern that actually hit the resonant frequency of a bridge, and you can think of it like a feedback loop. It just gets worse and worse and worse, and then it falls apart. So it's kind of just generic examples of feedback loop-like things. But in terms of a warp core and warp coils, as much as we know about them, you can imagine that whatever field presence is going on right now, they're trying to do their thing. It's getting worse. It's making the situation worse and worse and worse, and they have to break that cycle. Otherwise, the ship's going to blow up. And they do say they actually need to eject the warp core, but they're not able to do it. So the question is, could there have been a disruption with the tachyon exhaust and the gravimetric field? That's entirely possible. We don't necessarily know how tachyons interfere or are present in a stable warp core because they weren't at warp. They're observing it. So we know there are tachyon emissions. Tachyons are faster than light particles. We know that there are these emissions when you're at warp, and they do talk about the presence of tachyons in the warp core, but we don't necessarily know. But I'm happy to go with that it could be causing some of that interference and getting into this feedback loop. And so he says they basically need to be realigned. So however the warp coils are, let's just go into imagination land with this. Let's just imagine that the gravimetric field knocked one of the warp coils out of alignment. Maybe just imagine it's touching the other one or it's interfering with it somehow. So it's starting to speed up and get really bad. They say they need to be realigned. That's where I kind of got that visual from. They need to get Jake doesn't listen to his dad. His dad is like, Jake, get me the interphasic compensator. Sure. Interphasic compensator. Let's imagine again, feedback loop. Instead of with electricity, let's think about waves again, that you get these waves that are maybe cresting on top of each other and making the situation worse. So you get this interference pattern. Again, we talked about phases like last week where you get, a signal frequency, you get crests and troughs. And if you have two signals and the crests are on top of each other, then they're going to have constructive interference. May flash some of you back to introductory physics, constructive interference, which will make them stronger. And if this feedback loop is just spitting out wave patterns that are aligned with each other such that every cycle the crests are matching up, that would be a feedback loop that would increase the amplitude on every cycle that they're doing. So to get an interphasic compensator means that you would have to get something interphasic to break the phase of this process that's going on. Did we science that? I think we scienced that for like 5 lines of techno babble. I think we pulled some pretty good science out of that one. So that's how I pictured it. If we're gonna, what's really helpful is to try to picture the type of science that's going on here, and that's kind of where I would go from. The issue is that thank you. The issue is that once they stabilized it, they basically, what happens is that there's this huge discharge. So maybe you can think that all of that energy, all that amplitude that was building up, that was about to breach the warp core, they managed to stop the feedback loop, but they weren't able to get rid of all that energy buildup. And so once they break that feedback loop, that all of that stored power needs to go somewhere, and they basically close a circuit between the warp coil, the interphasic compensator, Ben Sisko, and Jake. And Jake gets knocked aside and sees Ben Sisko just disappear. And then the sadness begins. So much sadness. There's not a ton of science. I don't want to start crying on a live stream, so I'm not going to get too much into it. One fun thing is everyone's trying to like take care of Jake, and it's really sweet and adorable. Nog takes Jake ion surfing in the holodeck. I want to know more. I don't know what ion surfing is. Jake didn't want to do it again, but we don't know if it's because it was just a bad experience or if he's still mourning his dad. But then we start to see that Ben is actually, we are in the visitor. You heard sadness. And so Ben appears in the evening when Jake is sleeping and basically is like, what happened? And then disappears again. This was sort of a year after the fact, or at least a few months after the fact. And they think it was a dream. Dax, tries to trusts him and thinks that something happened. And so tries to go see if there is anything there. There's a whole spiral of events. So by this point, the viewer has figured out that this is a time travel episode, basically, because there's such a cascade of events. And obviously you have old Jake telling this story back in time, but so much is happening on the station, and it's going through time and time and time. Bajor, once Sisko disappears, Bajor takes that as a sign that their emissary died, and they're basically like, no one's here to protect us. This is a sign that the Federation isn't actually here for us. And again, this is the first episode right after the Klingons show up and Worf comes to Deep Space Nine. And so Bajor thinks that the Klingons are going to attack them. They're imminent war with the Klingons. So they agree to a Cardassian defense pact, which is an interesting plot twist. It's not really relevant to the story. It's just interesting. So then at this point too, everyone's kind of evacuating the ship, and Jake is walking through, and Sisko does show up again. Ben Sisko shows up, and it's not a dream. Jake runs over to him. He can touch him. They get him into the med bay. Then they start to, so now we're back to science. We're out of sadness, briefly into some science. They start to figure out what happened. So they're scanning him, and they're saying that something knocked his temporal signature out of phase. Okay, so here we are with the phase again. Phase is a fun phase is a fun phrase to use. Whew. And helpful for a lot of stuff. Temporal signature out of phase. What could that possibly mean? One way to think about it is just like spatial phases, frequencies. We talk about this idea of space-time, right? The whole principle behind it is that our universe is 4-dimensional. There's 3 dimensions in space and 1 dimension in time. Time we don't have any control over. But when you study, especially you go into special relativity and general relativity, and if you start studying space-time and the idea of causality, and you end up crying a lot in the shower because you don't understand it. I'm not saying that 4 times. And you draw these ideas of causality and these world lines. So you have space down here and you have time here. And then you're trying to figure out when things happen and what causes what. And this is a way to visualize the concept of causality. And again, cry a lot. Give yourself a lot of headaches. And, but when they're saying that his temporal signature is out of phase, let's throw away the phase idea with waves and frequencies, but let's just say it's not where it's supposed to be. So in this space-time diagram, space and time, we constantly go through the time dimension at a constant speed. 1 second per second is the way to think about it. We just don't have any control over it. And you could be thrown where you're in that same spatial coordinate, but your time coordinate, you've just jumped to another position. So that's kind of how you can think about having your temporal signature be thrown off, is that you still are operating normally 1 second per second, but you've been thrown into a different realm, a different coordinate point, basically. So they figure this out. They've explained that a year has passed, and for him, obviously, like, he hasn't aged. He doesn't realize what's been going on. They realized that the warp core discharge knocked him into subspace. Okay. So warp core discharge knocked him into subspace. The warp core deals in subspace. It's warping space-time. That idea of, like, we have our sheet of space-time. What's above the sheet, what's below the sheet is subspace. When we're building warp bubbles, we're, manipulating space-time. So there is a subspace component to that. And so this discharge through technobabble, which is what I'm here to explain, but through technobabble, through some particles that are there that they've never explained, this discharge knocked him into subspace. And they say what they need to do is they need to realign the temporal signature so he's not pulled back. So again, we'll do that space-time diagram. Everyone is here. Ben is, like, somewhere up here. They need to get him back down here. So his temporal signature is behaving just like everyone else's. They try to use a containment field and a transporter beam. None of that works, and he disappears again. And the sadness sets in once more. I did make a note of an aside that I did actually enjoy, even though Melanie is kind of a super stalker. I don't want to be mean to her because this is such a good episode, and I'm not intentionally being mean. It's just, I deal with tragedy through humor, and if you follow my Twitter lately, that's how I deal with tragedy. And so even in really, really sad episodes, I just try to find something that makes it less sad so my emotions can process properly. Anyway, but Melanie says she's struggling with this idea of, like, she's saying, I'm not a writer. I've been studying to become a writer, but I'm not a writer yet. And I love this idea. This is a little bit of a tangent, but because one of the things I discovered especially going into the creative field, is at what point do you get to call yourself a writer? At what point do you get to call yourself an artist? At what point do you get to call yourself a science consultant? Like, if you decide that that's what you want to do and that's what you're working towards, then you are that, and that's so hard to get our minds around because we feel like and this is what she's struggling with, is she's trying to, like, learn stuff. She's like, I have to learn how to do it all right. I'm trying to study everything so I do it right. And then I can call myself the writer. And it's so hard to break yourself out of that. Exactly. I think so many people go through this. If you have that inner creative that you've always wanted to be something and you've wanted to pursue that, you can still be a writer, even if that's not your full-time job. You are a writer, or you are an artist, or you're an actor. Comics. And yeah, exactly. Like, it is you just have to shift that mindset. And I've done that. I've had to go through that process and say, no, like, this is what I am. And it's kind of like, it's not a fake it till you make it, because it is who you are. It's who you want to be. And anyway, I'll get off that pedestal, but it was really relatable. And I think the dialogue was really good about that. That I think the way she articulated her struggles with identifying herself as a writer and her connection to Jake Sisko, that she felt the need to show up at his house late at night in a storm. There we go again. Is understandable, and it is kind of relatable. So through this, they do insert the concept that this wormhole inversion is what caused the whole thing to happen. So as it's kind of playing through Jake's life at this point, there's a really cute scene. So Klingons have taken over the station. Everyone evacuates. Nog shows up with 3 full pips. Nog. I promise I'm not going to cry. He does say that Morn is running the bar. Quark got his moon, and Morn is running the bar, which I love. Entertaining people with his stories, because that's what Morn does. Morn is one of my favorite characters, unsurprisingly. Now, as he's here with his wife, so we see Jake's wife, Sisko does show up again, which is interesting because, yeah, it is. It's a winner. It's beautiful. And so Sisko does show up again, but he's in Louisiana now, not on the station. Everyone's left the station. That was one of the reasons that Jake was so hesitant to leave the station, is because he felt if his dad shows up, he's got to be there. And but because Sisko showed up in Louisiana at Jake's house, that's where they make the realization that he's tied to Jake, not Deep Space Nine, or not, I guess, not the Defiant. It wasn't, because that's where it took place. This is where I start to cry in the show. This is where I was like, all right, I'll go get my tissues. And, yeah, it's very emotional, very good scene. He finds out he's married, he's written books. They do, then it sort of flashes forward, narrated over, that they're finding a pattern to these appearances, that Dax has been studying this, and Jake has been studying this. Jake basically abandons his wife to try to find a way to bring his dad back. And I think the way he describes it is kind of relatable for a lot of us who've gone through graduate school, where you drift away from everything and everyone else and lose friendships and relationships as you're going through graduate school. That is understandable. They do make it clear in this that he's so obsessed with trying to find a way to bring his dad back that he does lose his connection with his wife, and she leaves. And but this is because they found that Ben Sisko shows up with a recurring pattern, which are fluctuations in the wormhole subspace field. So remember what we were talking about at the beginning. This whole thing kicked off because of that wormhole inversion, that there's a huge, the Star Trek technobabble is there's this gravimetric field surge that happens, but it's basically the wormhole is kind of spitting out a bunch of energy that has been building up over a regular period of time. But it's not always just one thing. The wormhole is opening and closing and taking on energy in mass and losing energy in mass. So the wormhole is constantly fluctuating. And as it's going through these cycles, it has possibly some regular fluctuations to it, which isn't insane. Like I said, we do see weird behavior, not with wormholes, but with other astronomical objects out there that do fluctuate and do have these regular patterns to them. And so Jake knows that his dad is going to appear again. And so that's how he gets led down this whole path of trying to figure out how he can bring him back. It flashes forward again to, a lot of us would love to see any wormhole behavior. Exactly. Wormhole fluctuations, anything, all of that would be great. Yeah, that's actually a really good analogy, saying that it's like smaller subspace quakes between this big inversion quake. I think that's actually a really good analogy. Thanks. I like that a lot. So it flashes forward again, and we get Captain Nog. We get Captain Nog. If it wasn't tearing my heart apart already, this is what does it. Also, if anyone watched this recently, as in since Picard came out, they've got the Picard badges. I went and checked both of them. It's the same badge. It's the same badge. I remember when they first showed the comm badge from Picard, and it was really similar to a lot of stuff. It's like it's okay. You could probably nitpick the exact size and the gap in between them, but it's the same comm badge, which was really cool. Because we'd seen similar stuff in other episodes, but it was and all good things. Yeah, I didn't realize it was in the Visitor. I was really excited. I wasn't the first person to figure this out, so that's okay. But I was proud of myself. I hadn't made that connection. They get everyone back together, and again, Captain Nog, they figure, okay, this inversion is happening again. This is the opportunity to go try to get Cisco back. We need the Defiant for some reason, good reason. I would do the same thing. Get everyone back together. Get the gang back together. Captain Nog is in charge of the Defiant. Awesome. Dax and Bashir are adorable. It's not clear if they're together, but they bicker like an old married couple, and basically Bashir won't shut up about his kids' science projects, which is adorable as well. They try to get all of this stuff together. They try to replicate the entire original scenario. You know, why not? It's so weird, and we don't necessarily know why. So, yeah, there you go. And so it starts to happen, and they pick up these subspace distortions, and it starts to give off. They pick up subspace distortions. Yay! That's the stuff, remember, point to point, wormhole here, subspace is the area around the wormhole. This is starting to behave weird. Awesome. Yep. Recreate all of your conditions as much as possible. You want to eliminate as many variables as possible. So that's what we're doing. Scientifically good. I'm not opposed to it. And you get the gang back together, which is great. Science. For science, as he said. So they pick up these subspace distortions, and it's going to give off a gravimetric wave, which, as someone who did her PhD in gravitational waves, we're owning that. That's going to be one and the same thing. But again, temporal inversion, you can imagine, you get a big... Gravitational waves are just ripples in space-time from changing gravitational fields. That's exactly what's happening here. This would be a gravitational wave that's giving off. They do make that connection. Ben shows up, same position. Jake is in the engine room with them, and he gets pulled into subspace with Ben. We cry some more, if we haven't cried enough already, because he has to admit, Ben's like, how are the grandkids? How's your writing going? And he's like, I gave up all of it to find you. And his dad is very dad mode with that. It flashes back, and Melanie points out the fact that he keeps saying that there's no more time, that he's telling her all of this because there's no more time. And Ben is going to show up. Jake admits and says that he's figured out that their behavior is like a tether. That's what's going on is they are tethered together through subspace, through normal space and subspace, and these regular patterns are pulling him through occasionally. And what he needs to do is he needs to cut the cord when it's the strongest to be able to go back to the accident. I'm not entirely sure I follow the logic with that. They didn't go to explain it that well. But in terms of storytelling technique, it's pretty good, right? That they need to be together. Jake needs to cut his side of the cord in order to send Ben back to where the original accident happened, which basically means once they're together, Jake needs to die, and that sends Ben back. You can sort of interpret it however you want, but whether it was because of the, how he's being pulled through subspace, if we really dig into it, you can try to figure out where on the space-time coordinates Ben originally was, how he's still stuck there. Jake needs to cut that, so then it drops him back. I just talked myself into this. So then it drops him back into that point in space and time, not dragging him through subspace. And then he's back at those original space-time coordinates. So we did science ourselves into it making sense, which is what we're here to do. So it's good. That's exactly what happens. And Jake, as he's dying, basically just says, just dodge the discharge. And that's what happens. He goes back. The warp core discharges. He jumps out of the way. Jake asks how he knew that was going to happen, and restores the timeline. Now, talking about timelines and time travel, this is a really interesting way of talking about it. There's lots of different methods of time travel, and there's lots of different theories of multiple universes. One of them is when you travel through time, you experience you've kicked off a new universe. That other universe is continuing on. Your universe goes on separately. Star Trek has done this with the Kelvin timeline. And that's essentially what happened here, right? That this event happened, which caused a whole timeline. They went back, that event didn't happen, so now this timeline is going to happen. And whether you talk about them as timelines or as multiple universes, that we kind of are using those interchangeably. That's the same thing. The really sad part about it, that seems to be that they don't say this, but from his reaction at the end of the episode, it seems to be that Ben Sisko remembers everything, which breaks my heart. And it's really sad. They don't necessarily say that and never really allude to it again. And I really hope that wasn't the case, but it's so sad. So the big takeaways from The Visitor, scientifically, were this idea of subspace inversion, that we get these gravimetric fluctuations or gravimetric waves, gravitational waves, and this concept of your temporal coordinates, that you move through space-time as a coordinate system in normal space-time, and subspace is sort of you can think of subspaces that, if we're going to get really mathy, which I don't necessarily want to impose on everyone here, especially when I don't have a whiteboard and something to draw on. If by any chance any of you have taken complex algebra, sort of late undergrad math level classes, where you talk about the imaginary plane, that's how I would think about it. I would think of, if we're going to math all of this, you have space-time, your normal space-time, and then subspace would be the imaginary plane laid on top of space-time. I really like that, and I am going to unpack that a lot. Is it similar to the quantum signatures they mention in Parallels? That's a really good question. Let's put Parallels on the list to talk about, because it might be. I did a talk at Star Trek Las Vegas last year on time travel in Star Trek. It was a lot of Star Trek, not much science, but it was really fun. And I have a picture of my whiteboard as I was preparing this talk that had every single method of time travel that Star Trek has ever used. And there is approximately a dozen different types of methods of time travel that Star Trek has used. And I remember, I think Parallels is slightly different from this. Yeah, it is. So the question is that what trigonometry is for? To understand your space-time coordinates? I've said this a lot. I don't need to get on a soapbox about this, but it breaks my heart that math is taught so poorly, that I feel like math is taught to most people imagine if a lot of us have tried to learn a second language, right? And you do a combination of learning how to conjugate verbs and using your words and sentences. The way math is taught is like you spend 10 years conjugating verbs and you never get to use it in a sentence. And there is so much cool math once you get to college, junior, even some sophomore level classes, but sophomore math classes and above, it starts to come together and it's awesome and beautiful, and you realize how much science and it's like it blew my mind once I learned that I could use three-dimensional calculus to just calculate how a pool moved and how a river moved the way it did. And I could do it with math on the paper, and it was amazing. So I'm sorry for all of you who never got that chance, but that's why I'm here, to get excited about it for you and teach it to you as much as I can, or you will sit and listen. So let's move on. Trials and Tribble-ations. Weirdly, not a ton of science in here, but a great counterpoint to the visitor, so we can all recover and have a glass of water and get rid of our dehydration, weeping headache. Trials and Tribble-ations, season 5, episode 6. If you haven't watched it, if you're here just, because you're like, well, I got nothing else to do and I'm sick of my usual background noise, so I'll throw this on. One of my friends retweeted this, whatever, star what. Go watch Trials and Tribble-ations. Even if you haven't seen any Star Trek, it's just funny. It's enough cultural knowledge. You know enough cultural knowledge to be able to get into Trials and Tribble-ations. But if everyone here is a Star Trek fan, then that's fine. And it's an amazing episode. So it kicks off. Department of Temporal Investigation show up. Our time cops, our favorite time cops. They come in and basically yell at Ben, and they say, we're here to investigate you, and you're in trouble now. And they actually say, why did you take the Defiant back in time? They say, it is 100% Mulder and Scully, the 24th century. They say, don't tell us it's because you were meant to go back in time, comma, a predestination paradox, that you were meant to go back in time. And he's like, no. Like, good, we hate those. Fun fact about this, if you dig into the world of time travel and all the different paradoxes that exist and how you resolve time travel, how you explain time travel, all of that, if you go down a rabbit hole with this episode coined that term succinctly. So it's been used as time travel storytelling technique for a very, very long time, that you traveled back in time because you had to, that if you hadn't traveled back in time, it wouldn't kick off. And we'll come back to that, because there's a really hilarious example of that later in this episode. But the fact that they said that you were meant to go back in time, a predestination paradox, we now, in time travel storytelling discussion, call it predestination paradoxes because of the way that they describe that in this episode. So, fun fact. They pick up the Orb of Time. That's our time travel method for this episode. The Orb of Time. This is in the... Exactly. Oh, man. Thank you. Domestic 6000 said, this is how we explain Terry Farrell's marriage to Adam Nimoy. I mean, you're not wrong. And I love you, Terry. But you're not wrong. I love that. So, so what the Orb of Time is the explanation. That they say, the Bajorans have all of these orbs of different things. They get a call. They didn't know at the time. That this was the Orb of Time. But yes, it is the Bajoran prophet thing. They say there's all these orbs out there. They got called. Cardassia, this is a weird way to kick off the episode, actually. Cardassia has called them. Yeah, MacGuffin prophets. Exactly. Cardassia has called Deep Space Nine, basically, and said, hey, we've got an orb for you that we'd like to return to you, which is funny. And they don't know what orb it is, but they take them up on their offer, go and pick up this orb, as well as a visitor. I know, that was so weird. Friendly little Cardassians just looking out for those Bajorans, trying to return all of their, religious artifacts. Whatever. Kicked off a great episode, so I'm not going to pick at it too much. They pick up a guy who has referred to himself as Mr. Waddle. We learn very quickly that Mr. Waddle is not his name, but shout out to the excellent name that he's given them, who is a merchant. And they, for these... yeah. I love it. The intergalactic historical antiquity laws. That's exactly what they're pursuing. So they pick up this guy, Mr. Waddle, and I mean, I wasn't even into Star Trek at this time when this episode came out, and I remember everyone talking about the fact that it was the same actor as the one from the original series episode, Darvin. Not Darvin. Arnie Darvin? Darvin's his last name. And it's the same actor, Charlie Brill, who did this. And so they've picked him up. Arn Darvin, thank you. And he's picked up with them. And they're off having an adventure. Again, some of my favorite lines from this episode, where they talk about Klingons being foul-smelling. He throws that out, that the foul-smelling Klingons. And they immediately turn around and start poking at Worf with this and say, "You're not foul-smelling. You have an earthy, peaty smell with a touch of lilac." And then immediately cut to O'Brien trying to get Dax to imagine that she smells lilac every time she's around Worf. She's like, "I'm not doing that because I would die." I know better than that. But it's hilarious and one of my favorite moments in Star Trek. As they're going through, there's a surge in chronoton radiation. What is chronoton radiation? Chronotons are time particles. Theoretical, basically Star Trek time particles. Klingons smell like flowers and scotch, lilac and scotch. I'm down with that. I'm thoroughly approve of that. That's canon now. That's our head canon. Scotch and lilacs. And, Borg used them in First Contact. Chronotons have showed up a few times. They were one of my dozen ways that Star Trek has done time travel in the past. And they have a surge in time particles is basically going on, and they've fallen out of warp. And Dax says not only have they fallen out of warp, they are 200 light years away from where they last were, which is a not insignificant distance for kind of how far they're usually able to travel at average warp speeds. And there's also some time wibbly wobbliness that's been going on. And the Enterprise shows up, and that's a great cold open. A long cold open, but a fabulous cold open. And then it cuts to the temporal investigators again, our Mulder and Scully time investigators, who are like, wait, which Enterprise? Because there's been a lot of Enterprises. Warp speed. How quickly he gets taken out to show how... Yeah, there's got to be a scale for Worf speed. How quickly he gets taken out gives you the scale for how strong those aliens are. I like that. They're like, which Enterprise? There's been a lot of them. And he's like, the first Enterprise. They're like, oh, Kirk. The bane of our existence. 17 temporal violations. He was a menace. Which is a fabulous thing to say. Because he's got such a reputation in so many different ways. They've revealed that Darvin basically took out the guards and used this orb, which we now know is the Orb of Time, to go to specifically this point in time and space. And they try to figure out why. This is when they immediately reveal that he's Darvin and that this was a story that happened where he was originally arrested and caught for trying to poison a grain shipment, which is what it was. If you didn't remember, you just remembered the tribbles and the little fun facts, but it's because he was poisoning the grain. And because I know we were kind of running close on time, but quickly, this is a great weird fact. So a few years ago, 4 years ago, when we were doing the 50th anniversary of Star Trek, I was giving a talk at conventions on the history and context, the historical and scientific context of Star Trek, and where we were in history and where we were in science 50 years ago, and the context in which Star Trek was written. And I did it with a friend of mine who's a huge Star Trek fan. Her name is Chris, and she grew up during that time, and she's also a Cold War expert. And she gave me a list of episodes that she wanted to talk about the historical context of the original series. And on the list was the Trouble with Tribbles. And I was like, Chris, why Trouble with Tribbles? Like, I don't remember any sort of historical allegory that could be pulled from this. And she's like, oh no, poisoning the grain. She's like, this was peak sort of Vietnam War era stressors that were going on in society, was this idea of poisoning imports and exports or poisoning exports to other countries was a big part of our social discourse at the time, and that was reflected in Trouble with Tribbles, and it was really interesting. I never would have made that connection. That's not being a Cold War historian. So anyway, fun, interesting fact about this episode. He was a Klingon who had disguised himself as a human, which we have seen in subsequent Star Trek series. And anyway, they get dressed up. They try to get on here. Yeah, it's really interesting connection. I love it. There's great conversation about why they're in red versus gold being, they explain all of these canon changes in just brilliantly hilarious ways. Now, there is some more technobabble they throw in here. The original Enterprise is using a duotronic sensor array to scan its field. The Defiant, being its cool Defiant ship self, yeah, exactly. The cool Defiant ship self is cloaked, and so they're not able to. They don't want to bring down their cloak to transport. So they won't see them. But because the Enterprise is using this duotronic sensor array, it is... They actually show the graphics of it, but it's basically pulsing out in different frequencies. So it sends out these pulses like radar waves to try to sense things as its sensor. And they realize that they have gaps in those pulses that they can use to drop their cloak, transport, raise the cloak again before the sensor sweeps past them again. So kind of interesting, kind of funny. Yeah. Orange and weird orange greeny sort of colors. The colors are all over the place, but we accept it because it's fun. They talk about this band shift in the scan cycle. That's shifting your frequency. And when it does that, they have the opportunity to drop the cloak and transport, which is awesome. And that actually comes back into play a lot. Now, they're off having adventure. They do throw out this fact that they have to keep their scan field. They're trying to scan for, I think they figured out it's a bomb at this point. Or that he's doing something. Oh, they're just scanning for him. They have to keep the scan field below 20 milliwatts. Otherwise, they'll set off the interior sensors on the Enterprise. So, the Enterprise scanners operate at above 20 milliwatts, which is a fun, random, not necessarily useful fact. But we can file that one away. This is where Odo starts poking at Worf about being afraid of tribbles. That the Klingons talk about the great Tribble hunt. And it's fabulous. And then Klingons arrive. And, oh man. And then there's a great scene. And this is where we're coming back to the predestination paradox. Great scene between Bashir and O'Brien in the turbo lift with Lieutenant Watley. If you don't remember this, first of all, when they first get there, Bashir and O'Brien, bromance for the ages, can't operate the turbo lift because they don't realize you have to like grab the pole and twist it and say the name. And then this Lieutenant Watley comes in. There's some checking out happening, and she basically shows them how to use... She doesn't intentionally, but she uses the turbo lift, and they realize what to do. Then they run into her again, and there's some flirty going on between Watley and Bashir. And O'Brien throws out a great line as well, saying, she's only using you to get to me. and Watley's like, oh, you're in medical. Oh, my physical's tomorrow at 1300 hours. I'm like, damn, she's pushing it. I mean, it's pretty on par for original series behavior, so I can't totally fault that. And yeah, then Bashir is basically like, oh, this is on. And he's like, my great-grandmother's name was Watley, and she was in Starfleet, and no one met my great-grandfather. Maybe this is a predestination paradox, that I was sent back to time so I could be my own grandfather. And then O'Brien is like, Kira beats them at that moment. She's like, are you ready to transport out? He's like, are we ever? And, but there's the other predestination paradox, which Thank you. We saw that brilliantly called back to in the Futurama episode Roswell That Ends Well. And if you don't think that we're going to be doing Futurama episodes in this weekly episode club, you would be wrong, because we are definitely going to do Futurama. I want to do Futurama after we do this episode and Time's Arrow, because they both, the Roswell That Ends Well is hugely reliant on the Predestination Paradox and the Time's Arrow. There's actually, I mean, there's a ton, but brilliantly. So we will be doing Futurama. But the Predestination Paradox, where Fry actually, spoiler alert, Fry actually does become his own grandfather, which is hilarious. In a, now we know, time travel Predestination Paradox. And I love too, he's like, don't you know about Predestination Paradox from elementary temporal mechanics at the academy? I super want to take that class. The other great line that someone here alluded to, which is the Predestination Paradox for Terry Farrell and Adam Nimoy, is when Spock and Kirk walk past, and yeah, the elementary level class, when Spock and Kirk walk past, and she goes, "Ooh, I had no idea he was so handsome," and Sisko's like, well, Kirk had a reputation. She's like, not Kirk, Spock. I mean, fair play. I don't disagree with her on that front. But hilarious all the same. And we do get the great conversion factor that 12 Klingons does constitute a swarm. So we're locking that one in as well. File that one away. Obviously, the whole great... Oh yeah, that her previous host encountered Bones before, and there was some wink wink nudge nudge there as well, which I freaking love. The only other, because I know it's late. Some of you are up really late. Some of you are waiting to have dinner. Now we just get into the pure. I mean, it's all been pure fun, but this is where we get our green screen filtered in bar brawl. You get to rewatch the excellent moment where Scotty beats up the Klingons for insulting the Enterprise. Not Kirk, but the Enterprise. That's what'll do it. When Worf doesn't even try to explain why the Klingons look different, that he just says, it's none of your business. We just do. It's not for outsider knowledge, which is awesome. And the last little fun science fact that we get, very delicate hands. Yeah, exactly. We don't speak of this. This is the Klingon. We don't speak of this. The last thing we have was used in the original Trouble with Tribbles, as well as this one, is the 1,771,561 tribbles. If you have one tribble that has a litter of 10 tribbles every 12 hours, in 3 days, you will get 1,771,561 tribbles. I did the math. It's exponential growth. Yes. It is exponential growth. If you have the number of tribbles, your final number of tribbles is going to be equal to the ones that you start with times the universal constant E to the power of your rate and times time. So N naught E to the KT. And I tried to reverse engineer this in two ways. The first way I did it was I tried to calculate what the rate was, what K was, and I ended up with, I made the mistake, it's been a while since I've done this stuff, I made the mistake of rounding too soon. So when I calculated K, I rounded it to 0.2. That does not get you the answer. I rounded it to 6 digits, and that got me much closer. So 1,770,973 in 72 hours. And you are not wrong. This was definitely done on a slide rule in the 60s. And, but you can do it the other way. You can say, okay, in 72 hours, we have 1,771,561. We started with 1. What is K? And you can do that way too. So, yeah, it's a lot of tribbles. And this has been used a ton of times as different fun science. I made my students do this calculation when I was teaching physics to teach about exponential growth, because 1 results in 10, results in each one of those results in 10, and you get an exponential curve, which are on our mind a lot these days that I don't want to dwell on too much because this is a happy place. Anyways, so they find the Tribble miraculously through some excellent, cutaways to the Tribbles falling out onto Kirk's head is them chucking the Tribbles out as they're scanning them. They use Kira. Thank you, Kira. Our resident Bajoran has figured out how to use the Orb of Time and gets them back, but not before Cisco gets to go and introduce himself to Kirk, as we always knew he would. He can't not. I mean, even they agree they would have done the same thing. So that's our episode club for this week. The big takeaways from the trial and tribulations is what exponential curves are, chronotons, time particles, great way to say that you're traveling through time, and this duotronic sensor that is pulsing out. It's basically a radar system that they can use those gaps to lower their cloaking device and transport without being detected. So good times. And I love the last comment on here that there's just so many Tribbles. That's the big takeaway. So many Tribbles. Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining. This was really fun. I hope you had a good time as well. These are two wildly different, yet both interesting episodes to talk about. I was pleasantly surprised with how much science was in The Visitor, while being an amazing episode as well, and I hope I don't have to watch that one for at least another 5 years. And I'm glad you had fun sciencing with me. I have fun sciencing and Star Trekking and geeking out with all of you. And next up, I might do another astronomy club, maybe tomorrow or Thursday, depending on how things, but that's going to be impromptu. My next definitely scheduled astronomy club class is going to be on Friday at 1 p.m. Pacific time, where we're going to pull up some planetarium software and I will answer space questions for an hour, which I love doing, and I'm always happy to. So feel free to throw any my way if you have any pressing space questions you'd like answered. If you want to take part in deciding what episodes we talk about on this, you can join my Patreon. That's where we get to vote on what episodes we're going to talk about next. It doesn't have to be Star Trek. It can be any science fiction that you want to know the science behind. If you want to suggest episodes, that's in there as well. And I will be posting this onto my YouTube channel if you want to send anyone there to go have a look, watch it for themselves, and comment. So thank you all again. Yeah, I'm glad you had a good time, and I will see you next time. So thanks again. Stay safe, stay happy. Live long and prosper. All right. Until next time. Thanks.